Well, and Harbor Freight now releases another power station. They actually sent me this one and this one, which I'm kind of surprised they sent me the second one just due to the fact that I was so harsh on this one. This was the first power station that Harbor Freight and Predator actually released, which this wasn't very long ago that I saw this at a show, and it's finally released the 350 and now the 2000 power station. Now the reason I was so harsh on this one is really just due to the fact that the slow charging speeds were a little bit kind of crazy as it took a long time to charge this, but also the competition in both of these ranges is pretty fierce. So this one being under the $200 mark wasn't bad, but there's a lot of other power stations out there that are under that. Now one thing is that when they do have sales and super coupons, that's when this one really looks like a much better buy. But when it's just at its regular retail price, well, then there's a lot of competition out there and others that you could probably choose from that have a lot better options. But enough about this one. But now we're just going to talk about this. We'll go over the specs and the features, and then I'll tell you how the testing went and some other information you should know about. This new power station will come with 2,000 running watts and 4,000 starting watts or surge watts, and it has a 1,545 watt-hour battery that is LFP or lithium iron phosphate. On the right side, you do have an on button, which this brings up the display, and as you turn on other functions, then you'll see the time till empty along with which one is actually on, like this DC as you can see here for the car, which this is going to show you your output and of course state of charge. You do have a 12 volt 10 amp socket, which we will test this later. You do have a whole string of USB-C and also USB-A ports, which these are going to be able to provide up to 100 watts out and also 60 watts depending on which item you have or need. And then you do have your inverter, which turns on these AC outlets, which you have 4 plugs. Each one of these is a 20 amp outlet that provides 120 volts, which this puts out a pure sine wave, which we're going to test at, and this is a neutral floating power station. On one side, you do have an intake vent, and the other side is where you will find your exhaust that has the fans on this side. On the back is where you'll find the AC inlet and also your DC inlet, which we're going to test this later for solar input, which this says it can provide 800 watts of max solar input between 12 and 50 volts. You also have a reset button. Now on the front of the unit, there is this sticker that says fully charge before first use or voids the warranty, then charge it every 3 months. Now I don't know about you, but I do like it when power stations do come with a storage compartment because then all of the cables stay with you. A lot of the other leading name brands do not do this, which I kind of wish they would, like EcoFlow, Bluetti, and more. So there's only really a couple options out there that do this. I'm a big fan of having a storage compartment just because, again, I can keep the cables with it. That way when you want to grab this and go, you know everything's already there with you. Now this is only going to come with 3 cables. It will come obviously with an AC charging cable. It will come with a DC charging cable. This one's only going to allow about 110 watts of input power, give or take. And then you do have a solar input cable, which this one is kind of nice because it gives you 2 leads. This allows you to put 2 separate arrays on here for a total of about 800 watts of solar input. Now Harbor Freight also released their new solar panels. These are 200 watt solar panels that do come with a really nice case. This case does also include a couple little extras in it, like an adapter. It comes with a barrel port, so you can use this to actually charge up other popular power stations that are out there, but it will come with the MC4 adapter as well. Also some anchors, that way if you do put this out where it might be windy, you can anchor the solar panel down with the little attached anchors, which is kind of a nice touch. It also has magnetic closing on it as well, so the legs will close up against it along with the red closing handles. These will automatically just clamp closed because of the magnets, and these are really easy to set up and take down. They are ETFE coated, so they are kind of pretty standard of what's out there, and it would be coming in at a pretty competitive price, at least as far as the retail goes. But I would definitely be paying attention for those sales, because when these do go on sale, it's pretty hard to compete with some of the stuff you can just go pick up at Harbor Freight. But we'll talk a little bit more about the solar panels in a little bit. We're going to go over some more about the power station. Now when it comes to AC charging, this can do up to 1500 watts, so it takes just a little bit more than an hour to be able to charge this, which is much better than the 350. And when it comes to DC charging, the 800 watts of solar, which you can see here, I did a simulation test basically creating my own solar with DC in, and I was able to max it out to the 800 watts. Now this does have a MPPT solar charge controller in it, which is what all the good power stations are using nowadays, much better than the PWM, which was the pulse width modulation ones. Those were not as good. They still work great, but they're just not quite as efficient as the newer ones. So now when it comes to AC and DC charging, you can do that, but again, you're gonna be maxed out at 1500 watts. It's not going to be 1500 watts of AC plus 800 watts of DC, which some of the other power stations out there, you can actually combine it with 1500 watts and a little bit more solar. Sometimes it's not the full max of the 800, but if you're only making 500 watts of solar input, well then the other 1000 watts is going to come from the AC charging. So it's going to basically supplement whatever you don't get from solar. So if you're getting the full 800 watts of solar, well then you'll get 700 watts of AC, but basically it allows this to charge in about an hour and a half or so. So that's not bad. Again, it's still acceptable for a bigger power station like this, which again has a 1545 watt hour battery. Now this unit also does come with pass-through charging, so that means you can plug it in, it'll start charging, and it'll also be able to run the equipment that you might have plugged into this. So if a refrigerator is drawing 200 or 300 watts, it'll pull that 200 or 300 watts from the wall, pass through this, and then of course whatever else is left, it'll keep charging this if it needs to be charged. If it's 100% charged, that means the power just passes right through it and it is basically ready for you, kind of like an emergency power supply, which is one thing this does have. An emergency power supply just means you can use it just as that, as emergency power. That way, if you want to storm prep, you know a storm is coming, you can plug, say, your refrigerator into this, plug this into the wall, and if you have to go to work and the power does go out, you'll know that this is going to be able to run your refrigerator for several hours depending on the conditions outside, the size of the refrigerator, and more. But this one does have an EPS function, so it is a 10 millisecond cutover. But again, if you're running sensitive equipment like supercomputers and more that are running high loads, I would honestly buy a 0 millisecond UPS, because if you have higher equipment like that, you really should buy something that's more designated just for that. So now when it comes to some of the testing, such as like idle tests and more to see how efficient this is. Now there is one thing I wanted to do was an idle standby, and that's basically turning on the unit, then turning on the AC inverter, and then just letting it idle with no loads on it for about 12 hours. You start at 100%, you let it run for 12 hours, and then it kind of gives you an indicator on this somewhat accurate fuel gauge, which is not 100% accurate, but it just gives you an idea. Now, a lot of us do idle tests like that just to kind of get an idea of what the idle is, because some of these will draw 30, 40, 50, 60 watts an hour, depending on the type of inverter that's in here. So if you look at bigger string inverters, such as this one is EG4, it can have an idle consumption of about 44, 45 watts. Same thing with like a Delta Pro Ultra burning about, well, 30 watts. Or many other power stations out there, they all consume power as soon as you turn it on. Even if you're not running loads, just sitting here it is using power because it's on. But the thing is with this one is that if it doesn't detect a load, well then in 1 hour the AC will shut off automatically, and then in 2 hours the DC shuts off automatically. So that way if you're not around, there's no loads, it's going to automatically shut off, saving you basically coming back to a dead power station, which if you've ever had a power station like that and you leave it on, 2 days later you come back and you notice the whole thing is dead. So it is kind of a nice feature. Unless you're wanting to toggle loads on and off, then maybe this might not be the one for you, but sometimes simplicity is kind of nice. So that's just something you'll have to consider if you're wanting to do a load that you're going to toggle on and off all the time. Now this does have a 2000 watt inverter, so I decided to see how far it could go, and I found that about the 2200 mark was actually where it would shut off. It would last about a minute and a half before it wasn't able to handle that load anymore. So I ended up backing it down to around 2150 watts, and I was surprised I was able to hold that load all the way past 10-minute mark, also while adding more loads such as DC. So this allowed me to pull even more power out of the power station while it was actually exceeding its ratings on the AC inverter. And if you also take a look at the pure sine wave, you can see that the wave is clean all the way above its 2000 watt limit, and not to mention the total harmonic distortion was also well within range, which most of all these power stations, or if you were to get an inverter generator, is going to run around that 3% to about the 5% range, which this one held fine within the 3.5 to about 4.3 is pretty much as high as I saw. So the power station did exactly as it should. It has a good inverter board in it, and so that tested and passed with no problem. So if you were to run this at a full max of 2000 watts that it's rated for, then there shouldn't really be any problem with that, maybe unless it's extremely hot out. But most people do not run these things at a full 2000 max anyway, because if you did, it's not even going to last an hour because it only has a 1545 watt hour battery. Now, while I was doing AC testing, I also did an AC capacity test just to see how much power we could get out of this, just to see how efficient the inverter is. So I ended up doing a 0.2 C rate, which is about 310 watts. I was able to get close to that at about 310, 320, basically using this little heater. This allowed me pretty much a 1-for-1 on my power factor. That means if I'm pulling 100 watts out of here, I'm actually burning 100 watts. So for those who are kind of on the nerdy scale, who like to have all the details, basically the power used was pretty much a 1-for-1, which ended up bringing me a total of 1,395 watt hours, which that ended up being just a little over 90% efficient. I ended up doing this a couple times actually, and both of the numbers were relatively the same. So 90% was pretty much the average, which that's actually pretty good for a little power station like this. Most of us like to see at least 85% or better when we do capacity tests, just to see how efficient the inverter is and how well it's matched up with the battery, because as a friend of mine says, you don't want to have a big inverter with a small battery, because then you have big inverter, small battery syndrome, and nobody wants that. Now, when it comes to DC capacity testing, I also did that as well by setting up a load of 120 watts. Now, after several hours of that 120 watt load going by, it ended up providing 1,317 watt hours, which I again did that test a couple times as well, and basically both of those tests were almost exactly identical, at least under my testing, so it averaged out to around 85% efficient as far as what I was able to get out of this battery on a DC load at 120 watts. And of course, while I was at it, I did do a DC load test. So I wanted to see how much power I was able to get out of this 12-volt socket, because a lot of times people like to run diesel heaters, and that's one of the things I like to run. And sometimes diesel heaters can draw over 150 watts. The newer ones, though, are much better, only drawing around 120 to 130 watts. So now much more of them can do this, but I was able to get about 150 watts out of this socket, but only for a few seconds until it tripped. But when I did back that load down to 140 watts, I was able to hold that load for over 10 minutes, which was really good, because then that gave me some confidence that I would be able to run higher loads for diesel heaters and more. So I was able to go outside and also run a diesel heater. So this one from H Calorie was one that I reviewed recently, and is one that I've already used a couple times, and so far has been doing well. But as you can see, this was able to fire it up, and then after it got fired up and it was running, it was easily able to run that diesel heater. So I have no doubt that this will be able to provide long hours of diesel heater running out in the field or wherever it is you want to be, because diesel heaters only sip energy. So it's kind of nice, because when they're on low, they'll only burn maybe 15 watts every hour, and then when they're on high, they're using anywhere between about 35 to 45 watts depending on the diesel heater that you might have. But while I was doing that DC load test, I also plugged in some other DC items using the PD100, and also charging up my favorite jump starter, which is the one from Gulu. This one actually has a heating function in it. There's not many jump starters out there that actually have a heater function in it, due to the fact that lithium batteries, if they are too cold, they need to be heated before they're charged. So it's just kind of a nice little feature that they did include, but I was able to add higher loads to the DC on this, and I don't use a whole lot of DC. It's usually just 1 or 2 things at a time. So it was able to handle the loads that I put it on perfectly for over 10 minutes. And so this should have no problem basically charging most of the DC items that you're going to run. Now again, when it does come to solar charging, again, this can handle up to 800 watts. Those new Harbor Freight solar panels, they ended up sending me 4 of these so I could play with them a little bit. And so far, these are really nice. I ended up setting up all 4 of these solar panels on a relatively clear day. I happened to have finally some clear sun on a nice clear day after some storms had moved out, and I was able to set these up. And one thing that's nice is that these do come with a lot of nice features. Is one, the MC4 cables are long enough to where if you put them side by side, as I have them shown here, you're able to connect them into series. So this then allows you to run 2 of those solar panels into series, and then you can parallel both sets in. And again, that's where this solar charging cable comes in handy. It's almost like they kind of knew what they were doing, obviously, when they built this, or some of the other power stations they will have coming out, is that by utilizing that cable, it was actually really simple to just plug in all 4 of these solar panels. And just by plugging them in and just setting the solar panels out there, I was able to get almost 720 watts without really even trying. But because they do put adjustments on the leg as well, this allowed me to kind of fine tune it a little bit more. I didn't even get my light meter out, but I just used the adjustments that are on the legs, set them down a little bit more, because now that we're coming out of the winter and the sun is getting higher in the sky, I ended up angling these down a little bit more. So after angling all 4 solar panels and just kind of aiming them a little bit more towards the sun, I was able to get between 735 and 740 watts out of all 4 of these solar panels. That's about what you'll see out of most 200 watt panels, is about 185 to about 190, maybe a little bit more depending, especially on the flexible portable ones. Okay, pros and cons. Let's talk about the solar panels first because that's kind of where we ended. But when it comes to those, the quality build is fine. It should be good for the recreational user. And they have really long cables, which is nice, along with the adapters, plus not to mention the anchors. So it ends up being to where it's a nice solar panel that comes in a nice carrying case. And because it is at Harbor Freight, you will be able to pick it up locally. Now, when it comes to the price, well, that's where the price wars begin because there's a lot of options to choose at that pricing. I'm not going to mention price because it goes up and down all the time, so you can check it online if you want. But there is one thing you do know about Harbor Freight is that they have the super coupons, the sales all the time, so that's when you can really take advantage of buying those and getting a heck of a deal. So that's something I would look out for, not to mention open box deals that they have. Now, if there was something I would like to see on the solar panels is really an extra leg. I don't like the 3 legs. I would rather have 4 legs so it supports each individual panel. But, you know, overall, it just makes it harder to close when you have 4 legs like that. So it makes the whole footprint a little bit bigger. Now, when it comes to this power station, I'm going to give this basically an A- because this thing really is a good power station. It tested fine. It's also quiet. When I had the sound meter right up next to it under full loads, it was in the low 60s, and from 3 feet away, it was in the 50s. So overall, there are power stations out there that are much louder than this. When it came to testing, it tested fine. The pure sine wave, also total harmonic distortion, was all within the ballpark. This one just doesn't come with any frills or anything. So if you wanted more, you know, kind of the techie options like Bluetooth and more, this doesn't come with that. So that's something you're going to have to decide if you want, because those options are nice, but also can be sometimes a hindrance when it comes to firmware updates that could brick your unit. That's where this kind of comes in a little bit more in that simplistic and common sense scale, is that sometimes simple is good because you just want to go out there, turn it on and use it. And that's, you know, really when it comes to emergency backup power, you want simplicity and you know that it's just going to work. So some people like lots of options and all the buttons and things. This one is a little bit more into the simple times where we started, but you know it works. Now, one of the things I would like to see changed on this really is just the solar input. Please get away from 60 volts if you can. This one is at 50 volts. Having a higher voltage range allows you to configure your solar arrays in so many different manners, plus also using third-party solar panels of varying sizes. So having a 60 volt limit like a lot of these other companies are doing really kind of makes it a little bit tougher. This one's only 800 watts. It's not that big of a deal. But when you have a higher voltage range, like 100 volt minimum, it allows you so much more when you have solar configurations that you want to do, putting things in series and parallel. And the more you do it, the more you find out that having about 100 volts is so ideal. I mean, if I had it my way, 150 volts would pretty much be the minimum on everything. But overall, great power station. The only thing you're going to have to decide now is that do you want to pay for it? Because that's where, again, just like the solar panel, it's a crazy price war in this range. Now, being that it's new, it's obviously going to be at that higher price range around the retail mark. There's not going to be a whole lot of sales and discounts like closeout models that you'll see from a lot of other brands right now. So, but again, like Harbor Freight does, they always have sales, they always have coupons and stuff. And so that's when this can get real competitive. And again, being able to buy it at a store. So, and just for full disclosure, yes, Harbor Freight sent this out to me just like the other one along with the solar panels, but they don't pay creators. They also don't give discount codes. They don't give you sale links or anything like that. I don't make any money from this video because I can't say, hey, click the link down below and buy it from me, and here's a discount code and stuff. It's just them sending it to me, and I simply tell you what I think, which is kind of nice because Harbor Freight doesn't give you any kind of a script or things they want you to say, which I hate that from other companies, hence I won't review their products. And a lot of times I'll just buy the unit on my own, that way I can say whatever I want. I don't like the fact that a lot of these companies want to control what you say, hence I don't do it. But that's one nice thing about Harbor Freight. They're like, here you go, let us know what you think and beat it up if you want. And I thought that was kind of interesting because not a lot of companies will do that. That's why I wasn't very nice on the 350. I was like, But again, so what do you guys think? Is this worth the price? Is it cool to see Harbor Freight coming out with more power stations? I hope you guys liked the video. Let me know what your thoughts are, and I hope to see you in another one.